June 6, 1944. Dawn breaks cold and gray over the Normandy coast. Through the mist and smoke, thousands upon thousands of flat-bottomed vessels surge toward the beaches, ungainly, boxy, utilitarian machines that seem to defy every principle of naval architecture. They are not beautiful, they are not fast, but they are there, in numbers that darken the water from horizon to horizon, disgorging men and machines onto hostile shores with a rhythm as relentless as the tide itself. A German artillery observer, crouched in a concrete bunker above Omaha Beach, stares through his periscope at the spectacle unfolding below and whispers into his field telephone a single word that will echo through the corridors of the Wehrmacht High Command: unmöglich. Impossible. The landing craft, those humble, mass-produced vessels with names like LCI, LCT, LCVP, LST, had become the unsung architects of Allied victory, the maritime workhorses that transformed modern warfare from a contest of battleships and bombers into something altogether new, the projection of industrial might across oceans, the delivery of entire armies intact onto enemy soil. They were America's secret weapon, hidden in plain sight, and their story did not end when the guns fell silent in 1945. What happened to these vessels in the years after victory is a tale rarely told, a chronicle of transformation and repurposing that reveals as much about American ingenuity and global power as the war itself. But to understand what became of these craft, we must first understand what they were, and what they represented to those who faced them. In the early months of 1942, the strategic situation facing the United States and its allies appeared almost insurmountable. Nazi Germany controlled continental Europe from the Atlantic to the gates of Moscow. Japan's empire stretched across the Pacific, swallowing territories with populations numbering in the hundreds of millions. Britain stood alone in the West, bloodied but unbowed, yet incapable of mounting any offensive that could challenge German hegemony. The Soviet Union, reeling from catastrophic losses, screamed for a second front, for relief from the relentless Wehrmacht divisions hammering at Stalingrad and Leningrad. The strategic imperative was clear. Somehow, the Western Allies would need to project vast armies across hostile waters and deposit them on fortified shores. They would need to do this not once, but repeatedly. In North Africa, in Sicily, in Italy, in France, and eventually in the Pacific Islands defended by fanatical Japanese garrisons. Yet in 1942, the United States Navy possessed virtually no vessels designed for amphibious assault. The Marine Corps had experimented with a handful of prototype landing craft in the 1930s, but these were measured in dozens, not thousands. The challenge was not merely tactical or operational. It was industrial, a problem that could only be solved by the full mobilization of America's manufacturing capacity. What emerged from this mobilization was unprecedented in the history of warfare. Between 1942 and 1945, American shipyards produced more than 43,000 landing craft of various types. Not 4,300, 43,000. The numbers strain comprehension. 23,398 LCVPs, those 36-foot plywood boats that could carry a platoon of infantry. 1,435 LCIs, larger vessels capable of transporting 200 troops directly onto a beach. 1,051 massive LSTs, tank landing ships displacing 4,000 tons when fully loaded, each capable of carrying 20 Sherman tanks or 60 trucks across an ocean. Hundreds of LCMs, LCTs, and specialized variants, flak ships, rocket ships, headquarters ships, repair ships. All mass-produced in an industrial symphony that turned boatyards in Louisiana and Oregon and Pennsylvania into assembly lines churning out vessels at a rate that left foreign observers, both Allied and Axis, struggling to believe the statistics. German naval intelligence officers, analyzing reconnaissance photographs and intercepted communications, repeatedly questioned their own data. Surely the numbers were inflated, exaggerated for propaganda purposes. No nation, they reasoned, could possibly construct vessels at such speed, in such quantities. The reports were rechecked, cross-referenced, verified, and still the numbers climbed. Japanese admirals, trained in the traditions of the Imperial Navy where each vessel was a precision instrument lovingly crafted over months or years, examined intelligence briefings on American landing craft production with expressions of disbelief. The Americans, they concluded, were not building ships. They were stamping them out like rifle cartridges, like tin cans, like mass-market automobiles rolling off Henry Ford's production lines. And that was precisely the point. The landing craft represented a revolution in military thinking, a distinctly American approach to the problems of modern war. European and Japanese military traditions prized craftsmanship, elegance, the perfection of individual weapons systems. A German Panther tank was a marvel of engineering, each one assembled with meticulous care by skilled workers. A Japanese Zero fighter represented the pinnacle of lightweight construction and aerodynamic efficiency. These were weapons designed by societies that valued quality over quantity, artisanship over mass production. America's landing craft embodied the opposite philosophy. They were deliberately crude, simple enough to be built by workers who had never constructed a boat in their lives. The LCVP, designed by Andrew Higgins, a New Orleans boat builder who had previously specialized in shallow draft vessels for oil exploration in Louisiana bayous, consisted of a plywood hull, a steel ramp, a single diesel engine, and virtually nothing else. There were no crew quarters, no galley, no sophisticated navigation equipment. The vessel existed for one purpose: to transport men from ship to shore as quickly and cheaply as possible. If it survived one mission, that was enough. If it survived a dozen, that was a bonus. Dwight Eisenhower, reflecting on the war years later, stated without exaggeration that Andrew Higgins was the man who won the war for us. The Higgins boat, as the LCVP became universally known, made possible every amphibious operation in both theaters. Without it, there would have been no landings in North Africa, no invasion of Sicily or Italy, no D-Day, no island-hopping campaign across the Pacific. The vessel's humble appearance masked its revolutionary impact. It allowed armies to flow ashore continuously, not in carefully timed waves but in an unceasing flood that overwhelmed defensive positions through sheer volume. German officers who witnessed these operations firsthand recorded their astonishment in after-action reports and personal diaries. They had prepared for an invasion, certainly. They had anticipated Allied amphibious assaults. But nothing in their training or experience had prepared them for the industrial scale of the attacks that materialized. Where they expected hundreds of landing craft, thousands appeared. Where they destroyed a dozen vessels with artillery fire, 24 more immediately took their place. The Americans, one Wehrmacht general wrote bitterly, fought not with tactical brilliance but with material abundance so overwhelming that tactical considerations became almost irrelevant. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the United States military faced an unprecedented logistical problem. Scattered across England, France, Italy, North Africa, and dozens of ports throughout the Mediterranean, thousands of landing craft sat idle, their combat missions complete. The Pacific War continued, and many vessels were earmarked for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan. LSTs were loaded with equipment and dispatched toward the Pacific Theater, making the long journey through the Suez Canal or around the Cape of Good Hope. But when atomic weapons obliterated Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, forcing Japan's surrender, even this purpose evaporated. Now the problem intensified. Tens of thousands of landing craft, dispersed across every ocean and sea where Allied forces had operated, suddenly had no mission, no purpose, no justification for their continued maintenance or operation. The U.S. Navy faced a question for which history offered no precedent. What do you do with the world's largest amphibious fleet when there are no more amphibious operations to conduct? The first response was pragmatic and immediate: bring the boys home. In the months following VJ Day, many larger landing craft, particularly LSTs and LCIs, were pressed into service for Operation Magic Carpet, the massive effort to repatriate millions of American servicemen from overseas theaters. These vessels, designed to beach themselves and disgorge tanks and trucks, now carried weary infantrymen, pilots, sailors, and support personnel across the Atlantic and Pacific. The accommodations were Spartan, the voyages uncomfortable, but the ships served their purpose. An LST that had landed Marines on Tarawa might now carry those same Marines, older and quieter, back to San Diego or San Francisco, delivering them not onto a contested beach but to a dock where families waited with tears and handmade signs. But Operation Magic Carpet was temporary, lasting only until mid-1946. After the troops came home, the problem remained: what to do with 43,000 landing craft? The answer emerged in pieces, through a combination of strategic calculation, bureaucratic necessity, and quiet geopolitical maneuvering that would shape the post-war world in ways few historians have fully appreciated. Some vessels simply disappeared. Thousands of smaller landing craft, particularly LCVPs and LCMs, the plywood boats that had carried infantry onto the beaches, were surveyed, declared surplus, and destroyed. At ports throughout Europe and the Pacific, workers stripped the vessels of anything valuable: engines, radios, weapons mounts, and then towed the hulls into deep water. There, holes were punched in the hulls, and the craft were allowed to sink. Beneath the waters off Okinawa, Saipan, and dozens of Pacific atolls, hundreds of Higgins boats rest today, never to be recovered, their plywood hulls long since dissolved by saltwater and marine organisms. In the Mediterranean, the English Channel, the North Sea, the story repeats itself. The boats that won the war were scuttled like trash, their strategic value exhausted, their construction so cheap that recovery and transport costs exceeded their worth. For sailors who had crewed these vessels through combat operations, the disposal process carried a melancholy weight. These craft had been their homes, their protection, their means of survival. They had sheltered in the cramped wheelhouses during German artillery barrages. They had coaxed temperamental engines to life on cold Pacific mornings. They had felt the hull shudder as mines detonated nearby, had heard the metallic ping of rifle bullets striking steel plating, had watched brothers in arms step off the ramp into surf stained red with blood. Now those same vessels were being deliberately sunk, consigned to the ocean floor as casually as one might discard an empty ammunition can. But many craft survived, and their post-war trajectories reveal much about America's emerging role as global hegemon, as arsenal of democracy turned into underwriter of the free world. Hundreds of landing craft were transferred to allied nations under various military assistance programs. Britain received scores of LSTs and LCIs, vessels that would serve in the Royal Navy for years, participating in operations from Palestine to Malaya. France acquired dozens of landing craft, using them initially to re-establish control over Indochina and later in the bitter colonial conflicts that would define the 1950s. Nationalist China received landing craft that would eventually fall into communist hands during the Chinese Civil War, repainted and recommissioned to serve a very different political ideology than their builders had intended. Greece and Turkey, suddenly finding themselves on the front lines of the emerging Cold War, received substantial quantities of landing craft as part of the Truman Doctrine's commitment to containing Soviet expansion. These vessels, many of them worn and battered from wartime service, became the backbone of small Mediterranean navies, patrolling disputed waters, transporting troops to contested islands, maintaining a visible presence that signaled American support without requiring American personnel. The Philippines received landing craft that would serve for decades, eventually participating in operations against communist insurgents in the mountainous interior islands. South Korea received vessels that would prove crucial during the desperate early months of the Korean War, when United Nations forces, pushed into the Pusan perimeter, relied on waterborne logistics to survive. When General MacArthur launched his audacious amphibious assault at Incheon in September 1950, many of the landing craft involved were the same vessels that had stormed Pacific beaches 5 years earlier, pulled from reserve fleets or borrowed from Allied navies, their hulls hastily repainted but their essential character unchanged. The Americans, it seemed, were not merely transferring military equipment. They were exporting capability, distributing the tools of power projection to friendly nations, building a maritime network of allies who shared not only political ideology but logistical infrastructure. The landing craft became instruments of what historians would later call the Pax Americana, the American-led international order that emerged from the ashes of World War II. Where the Royal Navy had once policed global sea lanes with battleships and cruisers, America now secured the post-war world partly through the quiet distribution of humble landing craft to dozens of smaller nations, each vessel a tangible reminder of who had built it, who had given it away, and whose industrial power underwrote the defense of the free world. Many landing craft found civilian lives, transformations that were practical, profitable, and sometimes poignant. LSTs, with their capacious cargo holds and ability to beach themselves in shallow water, proved ideal for commercial purposes in areas with underdeveloped port infrastructure. Shipping companies purchased surplus LSTs for a fraction of their construction cost and converted them into inter-island ferries throughout the Pacific and Caribbean. An LST that had landed tanks on Normandy might spend the 1950s shuttling copra and passengers between remote Philippine islands, its tank deck now filled with sacks of rice and crates of vegetables, its bow ramp lowering not onto a hostile beach but onto a peaceful village shoreline where children played and fishermen mended nets. In Alaska, several LSTs were converted into cannery ships, processing salmon in waters where no permanent facilities existed. The vessels would anchor in remote bays during the summer fishing season, their former tank decks transformed into processing lines where workers gutted, cleaned, and canned thousands of fish per day. At season's end, the ships would weigh anchor and steam to Seattle or Vancouver, delivering their cargo to market and then returning north the following year. The crews were no longer young sailors preparing for battle but a mixture of Filipino, native Alaskan, and Scandinavian workers, many of them women, performing the unglamorous labor of industrial fishing in conditions that were demanding but not deadly, monotonous but not terrifying. Some landing craft became construction platforms. In the oil industry, particularly in the Gulf of Mexico and later in Southeast Asia, LSTs served as supply vessels and floating barracks for offshore drilling operations. Their flat bottoms and shallow draft made them ideal for approaching rigs in waters too shallow for conventional cargo ships. Engineers who had once loaded Sherman tanks now loaded drilling pipe and cement. Welders who had once repaired battle damage now built crew quarters and storage containers on modified tank decks. The vessels adapted, survived, found new purposes in a world that still needed their peculiar combination of capacity and shallow water capability. In rivers throughout Asia, landing craft became permanent fixtures. Several LCTs were sold to operators on the Yangtze and Mekong rivers, where they served as vehicle ferries at locations lacking bridges. The ramp design, intended to deliver military vehicles onto beaches under fire, proved equally effective for loading civilian trucks and buses onto ferries at muddy riverbanks. A Chinese truck driver in 1955, maneuvering his vehicle onto an LCT at a Yangtze crossing, had no idea that the ramp beneath his wheels had once lowered onto Omaha Beach, that American soldiers had run across that same steel surface into machine gun fire, that the rust-streaked hull beside him had witnessed history on a scale his imagination could not encompass. But the largest collection of landing craft did not go overseas, nor into commercial service. They went into mothballs, preserved in vast reserve fleets that stretched along the American coastline like maritime graveyards waiting for resurrection. The U.S. Navy, despite its eagerness to dispose of surplus vessels, recognized that landing craft represented capabilities that might be needed again. Wars, after all, had a tendency to recur. The ability to project force across water onto hostile shores might prove necessary in future conflicts. So rather than destroy or sell the entire amphibious fleet, the Navy retained thousands of vessels in reserve status, carefully preserved and maintained against the possibility of future need. At Sassoon Bay in California, in the James River in Virginia, at other locations along the Gulf Coast and in the Pacific Northwest, entire fleets of LSTs and LCTs were gathered, stripped of sensitive equipment, coated with preservatives, and moored in neat rows that stretched across the water like gray ghost towns. These were the reserve fleets, the sleeping armada, the insurance policy against an uncertain future. The scale was staggering. At peak, the James River Reserve Fleet contained more than 800 vessels, many of them landing craft. From the air, the anchorage resembled a city of ships, hundreds of gray hulls packed together in geometric precision, connected by chains and cables, watched over by a skeleton crew of civilian caretakers who conducted periodic inspections, pumped bilges, and performed minimal maintenance to prevent deterioration. For local residents, the reserve fleets became familiar landmarks, unchanging features of the landscape. Fishermen cast lines near the anchored vessels. Photographers captured haunting images of the rusting hulls at sunset, compositions of industrial decay and military memory. Children growing up near Sassoon Bay in the 1950s and 1960s absorbed the reserve fleet into their mental geography of home, unaware that the hundreds of identical gray ships represented the preserved capability to invade a hostile shore, to project American military power across an ocean, to repeat if necessary the operations that had defeated Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. The Korean War proved the wisdom of maintaining these reserves. When North Korean forces stormed across the 38th parallel in June 1950, catching American and South Korean forces unprepared, the United States military scrambled to respond. Within weeks, landing craft were being pulled from the reserve fleets, hastily reactivated, crewed by recalled reservists and newly trained sailors, and dispatched across the Pacific. The Incheon landing in September 1950, one of the most audacious amphibious operations in military history, relied heavily on these reactivated vessels. LSTs that had been mothballed in Californian waters since 1946 found themselves once again approaching a hostile shore, once again lowering their bow ramps under fire, once again serving the purpose for which they had been designed. After Korea, more vessels returned to the reserve fleets. The cycle repeated: activation, deployment, deactivation, preservation. Some landing craft saw service in 3 wars, World War II, Korea, and eventually Vietnam. By the 1960s, vessels that had been built in 1943 were still operational, still capable of beaching themselves and discharging cargo, their hulls patched and repatched, their engines rebuilt multiple times, their essential utility undiminished by age. The Vietnam War created new demand for landing craft, particularly in the Mekong Delta, where conventional naval vessels could not operate effectively. LSTs and smaller landing craft became crucial elements of riverine warfare, transporting troops and supplies through shallow coastal waters and up rivers too small to appear on most maps. Once again, the reserve fleets were tapped. Once again, old vessels were pulled from mothballs, updated with modern communications equipment and weapons systems, and sent to war. Sailors who had been born after World War II ended now crewed vessels built before they were born, maintaining a material connection to that earlier conflict even as they fought in a very different kind of war. There is something haunting about the longevity of these craft, about their refusal to die. Unlike aircraft, which become obsolete within a decade, or tanks, which are replaced by newer models every generation, the landing craft endured because their mission never changed and their design had achieved a kind of utilitarian perfection. You cannot improve upon a floating box with a ramp. You can add modern engines, better communications, improved weapons, but the fundamental concept remains sound. The landing craft built in 1943 could perform the same mission in 1973 as effectively as it had 30 years earlier. But most simply disappeared, their stories ending quietly in scrapyards or at the bottom of the ocean, their contributions unremembered except in official records and fading photographs. What, then, is the larger meaning of these vessels and their post-war trajectories? What truth about American power, about industrial capacity, about the nature of modern warfare can we extract from the chronicle of landing craft parks and reserve fleets? The landing craft represented a democratization of naval power, a transformation as significant as the shift from muskets to rifles or horses to tanks. Before World War II, amphibious operations were high-risk, low-probability ventures, attempted only when absolutely necessary and usually ending in disaster. Gallipoli. Dieppe. The historical record was one of failure, of brave men sent to die on beaches because the technology for projecting force across water did not exist. America's landing craft changed that calculus completely. They transformed amphibious assault from a desperate gamble into a reliable tool of military strategy, repeatable, scalable, limited only by industrial capacity rather than technical feasibility. This transformation depended not on brilliant engineering or technological innovation but on something more fundamental, the willingness and ability to build thousands of simple, unglamorous vessels and distribute them wherever they were needed. The post-war fate of these craft, given away to allies, sold to civilian operators, mothballed in reserve fleets, recycled into scrap, reflected America's unique position in the mid-20th century world. The nation was wealthy enough to build armadas and then give them away. It was confident enough in its industrial capacity to scrap thousands of vessels, knowing more could be built if necessary. It was far-sighted enough to preserve some against future need, and generous enough, or strategically wise enough, to strengthen allies by transferring military capability rather than hoarding it. The landing craft became, in this sense, instruments of a particular kind of global order. They were not symbols of American empire in the traditional sense. There were no American governors installed in occupied territories, no formal colonies extracted for resources. Instead, they represented a subtler form of hegemony, the distribution of capability that created dependence, the establishment of military relationships that evolved into political alliances, the building of a network of nations whose security depended partly on access to American equipment and American goodwill. German soldiers who had watched landing craft swarm ashore on D-Day understood, in that moment, that they were witnessing not just a military operation but a revelation of industrial capacity so vast that resistance was ultimately futile. Japanese officers who studied intelligence reports on American landing craft production reached similar conclusions. They were fighting not merely a powerful enemy but an enemy whose industrial base could produce weapons faster than they could be destroyed, whose logistical capability could deliver armies intact across oceans that had always provided natural barriers to invasion. And in the post-war years, as those same landing craft dispersed across the globe, serving in new navies, transporting civilian cargo, rusting quietly in reserve anchorages, they continued to broadcast that message of American capability. A Greek LST patrolling the Aegean, a Philippine LCT ferrying vehicles between islands, a mothballed reserve vessel in the James River. Each was a reminder, subtle but persistent, of who had built the post-war order and whose industrial might underwrote its continuation. There is poetry in the mundane. The landing craft were never beautiful. They were never celebrated in the way that battleships and aircraft carriers drew public admiration and patriotic fervor. No movies were made about LST crews. No famous photographs captured landing craft in the way that images of aircraft carriers or submarines entered popular memory. They were workhorses, forgettable and functional, valued for utility rather than appearance. Yet they were the indispensable instruments of victory, the vessels that made possible every offensive operation of the war. Without them, the Atlantic Wall would have remained impregnable. Without them, the Pacific Islands would have remained in Japanese hands, defended by garrisons that could not be dislodged by naval bombardment or air attack alone. Without them, the entire strategic concept of the war, using industrial capacity to overwhelm Axis powers through force projection, would have been impossible. And after the war, in their dispersal and their quiet service and their eventual obsolescence, they told a story about how democracies fight wars and build peace. They were mass-produced because democracies trust assembly lines more than artisans. They were distributed to allies because democracies understand that security is collective, that a strengthened Greece or Turkey or Philippines serves American interests as surely as a strengthened U.S. Navy. They were preserved and reserved because democracies plan for uncertain futures, hedging against threats that may or may not materialize. Today, nearly 80 years after their construction, the landing craft have finally passed into history. The last LST was decommissioned from U.S. Navy service in 2014. The reserve fleets have been dispersed. The vessels that remain in museums are artifacts, objects to be studied and preserved rather than used. The era they represented, of simple, mass-produced vessels deciding the fate of nations, has ended, replaced by a world of precision weapons, rapid deployment forces, and military capabilities so expensive that even superpowers must carefully ration their use. But the lesson endures. American victory in World War II, and American dominance in the post-war world, rested not primarily on technological sophistication or tactical brilliance but on industrial capacity married to strategic vision. The landing craft embodied that combination, simple enough to be produced by the thousands, effective enough to change the course of history, distributed widely enough to shape the post-war international order. They were humble vessels that performed extraordinary service. They were built to be forgotten and yet deserved to be remembered. They were America's secret weapon, hidden in plain sight. 43,000 floating bridges connecting industrial might to strategic necessity, carrying not just soldiers and equipment but the possibility of a different world, a freer world, onto beaches from Normandy to Okinawa and beyond. And when the war ended, when the victory was won, they did not simply disappear. They scattered across the globe like seeds, taking root in new navies and new purposes, preserving in their steel hulls and humble utility a memory of the industrial democracy that created them and the world-shaping conflict they helped to win. Their story is not one of glory but of service, not of heroism but of persistence, not of individual sacrifice but of collective capability, a story, in the end, that is deeply and unmistakably American.